Karen called the cops on a black firefighter. He turned out to be her HOA president's son. It started with smoke. Not the thick, black, billowing kind that makes you grab your valuables and run, but the subtle kind. A faint trail curling into the sky from the backyard of 412 Oakwood Drive. The kind that makes you squint over your coffee cup and wonder if someone's forgotten to turn off their grill. The kind that doesn't scream emergency, at least not to most people. But Karen Mallory wasn't most people. She stood at her kitchen window, arms folded tightly across her chest, wearing her usual lavender robe, lips pursed like they were holding back a full dissertation on the decline of neighborhood standards. Her eyes narrowed behind her designer glasses as she zeroed in on the yard in question. "That's not the Smiths' usual grilling day," she muttered aloud. Karen prided herself on knowing the schedule of every resident in East Briar Hills, a neighborhood that prided itself on manicured lawns, neutral-tone mailboxes, and a quiet that bordered on obsessive. Her husband, Raymond, had long since learned to tune her out during her daily observations. He continued scrolling on his tablet without lifting his eyes. "And I don't think that's even the Smiths," she added sharply. Raymond finally glanced up. "It's probably just someone helping out. A neighbor, maybe." Karen didn't respond. She leaned closer to the window, her nose practically touching the glass. The figure in the backyard was tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakably black. He wore a gray t-shirt, black cargo pants, and work boots. His head was shaved, his movements efficient but relaxed. He tended to a modest fire pit near the patio, carefully arranging the firewood and adjusting a cast-iron grate above the flame. Karen's eyes widened. "Oh, I knew it," she said. "That is not a resident. That man is trespassing." Raymond sighed. "Karen." She was already moving, marching into the hallway, phone in hand. "I'm calling the police. This is not okay. What if he's scoping out the house? Or worse, what if he's starting a fire on purpose?" "He's barbecuing, Karen," Raymond replied flatly, "and it's not illegal to be black in a backyard." Karen ignored him. She pressed the emergency number and put the phone to her ear, adopting a tone that was both breathy and urgent, her signature performance. "Hi, yes, I'd like to report suspicious activity in my neighborhood. There's a man, a tall black male in a backyard that doesn't belong to him. There's smoke, possibly a fire. He's messing with something near a grill, and I don't recognize him. I'm very concerned." She rattled off the address, thanked the dispatcher, and ended the call with a self-satisfied click. Raymond shook his head. "You really couldn't help yourself, could you?" Karen turned toward him. "If something happens and I don't say anything, I'm the one who gets blamed. You'll thank me when they catch him before he does something." Raymond didn't answer. He just turned the page on his tablet with a little more force than necessary. 20 minutes later, the first patrol car pulled into the neighborhood. Karen was already outside, arms crossed, expression righteous. Two officers stepped out, clearly relaxed but professional. One of them, Officer McKinley, had been on the Briar Hills beat for nearly 5 years. He recognized Karen immediately, and not in a good way. "Good morning, Ms. Mallory," he said, removing his sunglasses. "We got your call?" Karen nodded. "Yes, he's still there. Back of 412. I don't know what he's doing, but it doesn't look good." McKinley glanced at his partner, then approached the backyard. The man tending the fire heard them coming before he saw them. He straightened slowly, wiped his hands on a rag, and stepped away from the pit. "Morning, officers," he said, tone polite but cautious. "Sir, can we see some ID?" McKinley asked. The man raised an eyebrow. "Is there a problem?" "We got a report about possible trespassing and unauthorized fire activity." The man reached into his back pocket and handed over his ID without a word. McKinley glanced down at the name. Darius Wilson. McKinley looked up again, studying the man. "You're a firefighter?" "Yep," Darius said, folding his arms. "Station 8. Just got off a 36-hour shift. Came to check on my dad's place. He's out of town this week." "Your dad lives here?" the second officer asked. Darius nodded. "Name's George Wilson. He's HOA president, if that means anything." Karen, who had crept closer to eavesdrop, froze. McKinley looked at her. "Ma'am, do you know George Wilson?" Karen stammered. "Well, yes, of course I know George, but I didn't know he had a son," Darius finished for her, his tone just sharp enough to cut. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. then opened it again. I, I just didn't recognize you, she said quickly. I wasn't trying to. To what? Darius asked calmly. Assume the worst? McKinley handed back the ID. Sorry for the trouble, Mr. Wilson. We're all good here. Darius gave a tight smile. No trouble. Happens more than it should. As the officers turned to leave, Karen stood rooted in place, her face an alarming shade of pink. You're George's son? She asked weakly. That's what I said, Darius replied. I didn't know. He's never mentioned that he has a black son? Darius cut in. Karen flinched. No, I didn't mean it like that. Darius gave her a long look. You didn't need to say it. I got the message loud and clear. And with that, he turned back to the fire pit, calm and controlled. Karen stood there for a few more seconds before slowly backing away, the weight of what she'd just done starting to settle into her bones like winter. Later that afternoon, George Wilson returned from his business trip. He pulled into his driveway just as Darius was locking up the garage. Hey, Dad, Darius called. George smiled wide. Hey, son, you beat me home. Darius nodded. Thought I'd make use of the grill. Figured it was still yours. George chuckled. Always will be. But the smile faded when he saw the patrol car notes on his mailbox. What's this? He asked. Darius shrugged. Your neighbor called the cops. Said I looked suspicious. George's face darkened. Let me guess, he said. Karen Mallory. Bingo. George didn't speak for a long moment. Then he said, get ready for the next HOA meeting. We're going to have a very enlightening conversation. The community center was packed. Once a month, East Briar Hills hosted a mandatory HOA meeting in the rec hall next to the pool. Normally, these meetings were dull affairs, budget adjustments, landscaping disputes, complaints about teenagers skateboarding on the walking trail. But tonight was different. Word had spread. Karen had called the cops on the HOA president's son. Not only that, she'd called them on a black firefighter who had served during last summer's wildfire season, someone who had literally saved 3 homes in the next county over when a propane tank exploded. Karen arrived early, as she always did, clipboard in hand, lip gloss flawless. But the looks she got tonight weren't the usual polite nods and thin smiles. They were cold. Some were disappointed. A few looked downright disgusted. Karen sat down, legs crossed, pretending not to notice. George walked in with Darius by his side. A few neighbors actually clapped. George held up a hand to quiet the crowd, then stepped to the front. Thank you all for being here tonight. We have a lot to discuss. But before we begin the agenda, I'd like to introduce someone. He turned slightly. This is my son, Darius. You may have seen him around. What you might not know is that he's a decorated firefighter, a paramedic, and has spent the last 10 years putting his life on the line to save others. Polite applause rippled through the room. George's tone shifted. Last week, while I was out of town, Darius stopped by to check on my property. During that time, he was reported to the police as a suspicious black man by a neighbor. The room went quiet. Darius stood tall, eyes scanning the crowd. I wasn't wearing a uniform. I didn't have a badge. All I had was my skin, he said. A few people squirmed in their seats. George continued. We say we're a community, that we take pride in East Briar Hills. But pride without inclusion is just vanity, and safety that only applies to some is not safety at all. He turned to Karen. Karen, would you like to say anything? All eyes turned to her. Karen stood slowly. She looked smaller tonight somehow, not in size but in presence. I made a mistake, she said. I reacted without thinking. I was concerned. Someone near the back said, you were racist. Karen's eyes flashed, but she caught herself. I didn't know who he was, she said again weakly. That's the point, George said. You didn't ask. You assumed. And you endangered someone who has spent his life protecting others. Karen sat down without another word. The rest of the meeting went on, but the mood had changed. People listened differently, spoke with more care, looked inward. That night, George got 3 separate emails from residents thanking him for speaking out. Darius got 4 thank you cards, including one from a teenage boy down the street who wrote, you make me feel safer living here. But for Karen, The damage had already been done, and it was only just beginning. The days that followed were uncomfortable. Karen wasn't used to being the subject of neighborhood gossip, at least not in this way. Sure, she'd been known to correct people on their lawn decor or send strongly worded emails about the timing of holiday lights, but this was different. This time, people weren't whispering about her behind closed doors. They were openly avoiding her. Mrs. Cunningham, who normally shared gardening tips over the fence, now barely offered a wave. The Abernathys skipped their usual Sunday driveway chat. Even the mailman had a new tone of politeness, like he didn't want to be seen lingering too long near her porch. Karen kept telling herself it would blow over. People had short memories. But it didn't blow over, because Darius kept showing up. Not in a confrontational way. He wasn't loud. He didn't post angry messages online. He didn't even speak to her again. He just existed, in full view. He jogged through the neighborhood on his off days. He helped neighbors move heavy boxes. He fixed a broken bench at the park without being asked. He was everywhere Karen turned, and every time she saw him, she felt the sting of what she'd done echoing louder. It didn't help that a local blogger had picked up the story. The article, titled, "When Assumptions Harm, a Firefighter's Experience in a Gated Community," didn't mention Karen by name, but everyone in East Briar Hills knew who it was about. The writer had interviewed Darius and George, and the piece had gone viral in the surrounding counties. The comments were brutal. Typical HOA power trip. And he saved homes during wildfire season, and they call the cops on him? This is why we talk about systemic issues, because it starts in neighborhoods like this. Karen wanted to disappear, but she wouldn't admit it. Not yet. Instead, she tried something. Calculated. She baked muffins. It was Tuesday morning when she marched up the Wilsons' front porch with a forced smile and a covered basket in her hands. She rang the bell, adjusted her posture, and rehearsed the line in her head. Just a neighborly gesture. Let's put it behind us. The door opened. It wasn't George. It was Darius. He looked at her, not angry, just tired. "Morning," Karen said, holding up the basket. "I thought I'd bring these by. I wanted to apologize," he offered. She paused. "I suppose that's part of it." Darius didn't move to take the basket. Karen shifted. "Look, I misjudged. That's obvious. But I just want us to get back to being civil." Darius leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Civil," he repeated. "You want civility." Karen smiled tightly. "Yes, I think this community needs that." Darius studied her, then spoke calmly. "Civility starts with humanity, Karen, and you didn't give me that. You saw a black man with firewood and decided I was a threat. You didn't ask questions. You didn't check. You just called the cops. And the fact that you're here with muffins doesn't undo that." Karen stiffened. "I said I made a mistake." "You did," he said. "But what you're asking for isn't forgiveness. It's forgetting. And I'm not in the business of pretending things didn't happen so people like you can sleep better." Karen's face flushed. "That's not fair." "What's not fair," he said, stepping forward, "is being treated like a criminal in my own father's backyard." She opened her mouth to respond, but Darius was already closing the door. "Have a nice day, Karen." The click of the latch echoed louder than any slam. 2 days later, the HOA inbox started filling up, but not with complaints about Darius, with support. Residents began requesting a community appreciation event to honor neighborhood heroes. They mentioned Darius by name. Some suggested adding a section to the HOA newsletter that featured residents who had served the community in meaningful ways. Karen was on the HOA events committee, and she hated every second of it. At the next board meeting, George announced plans for the first Willow Award, a recognition given annually to a community member who exemplified service, kindness, and leadership. Darius was the inaugural recipient. Karen nearly choked on her coffee. After the meeting, she confronted George in the parking lot. "This is getting out of hand," she snapped. "He's your son. You shouldn't be using your position to play favorites." George turned to her, cool and collected. "This isn't favoritism, Karen. It's accountability. You want to talk about conflicts of interest? Let's talk about how you've used your role to bully people for years, over mailbox colors and wind chimes and garden gnomes." Karen bristled. "That's different. That's about maintaining standards." No, George said. That's about control, and your time controlling this place is running out. She narrowed her eyes. Is that a threat? He smiled. No, it's a warning. Later that week, Karen received an anonymous envelope in her mailbox. Inside was a printed stack of screenshots, Facebook comments, Reddit threads, even a snippet from next door. The Karen from East Briar Hills HOA is exactly what's wrong with these communities. Hope they vote her off the board. The firefighter handled it with grace. She should be ashamed. At the bottom, someone had scribbled in black Sharpie, "Your legacy is in the trash. Might as well retire with it." Karen's hands shook. That night, she opened a bottle of wine alone and sat on her porch for 2 hours without speaking to anyone. But Karen wasn't the type to go down without a fight. She started quietly by trying to plant seeds of doubt among the other board members. Don't you think George is using his role to push an agenda? Shouldn't we make sure this doesn't become a race thing? People are overreacting. It was just a misunderstanding. But no one bit. The mood had shifted. Even her closest ally, Trish Harmon, didn't back her. I just think maybe it's time to listen instead of defend, Trish said. People are hurting, Karen scoffed. So now I'm the villain? Trish gave a sad smile. Karen, sometimes the mirror tells the truth. Then came the budget meeting. George introduced a motion to allocate part of the HOA's discretionary fund to install a community emergency preparedness kiosk, complete with first aid supplies, emergency contact sheets, and a digital panel that would recognize local heroes. Karen tried to argue it was unnecessary spending. She was outvoted 7-1. Her no was the only one on record. That weekend, someone chalked "Thank you, Darius" on the sidewalk outside her home. She washed it off before anyone could take a picture. But the message was clear. This wasn't going away. A month later, Darius was invited to speak at the local middle school about being a firefighter and serving the community. The event was attended by teachers, students, parents, and Karen's own niece, Lily. Karen didn't know about the speech until Lily came over for dinner that evening. Aunt Karen, do you know Mr. Wilson? He's a real firefighter. He came to our school and showed us pictures and everything. He even saved a dog from a burning apartment. Karen dropped her fork. Lily continued wide-eyed. He said sometimes people look at him and think he's dangerous just because he's black. That's dumb, right? Karen forced a smile. Yes, sweetie, that's very dumb. Her stomach twisted into knots. That night, Karen stared at her reflection in the mirror. For the first time in a long time, she didn't recognize the woman looking back. Karen wasn't ready to give up. Not her standing, not her seat on the HOA board, not her identity as the order keeper of East Briar Hills. In her mind, this was just a phase, a flare-up, a public tantrum from the neighborhood that would eventually settle back into its old ways with her back on top. All she had to do was outlast the storm, so she began plotting. Step 1. Control the narrative. Karen reached out to a local newsletter publisher who owed her a favor. Marlene Simmons, editor of the Willow Gazette, a low-circulation but gossipy HOA-sponsored print. Karen pitched a community values editorial and ghost-wrote it herself, dripping in coded language. In these turbulent times, it's vital we remember what made East Briar Hills exceptional. Peace, tradition, and standards. We must not let emotion cloud judgment or allow sympathy to override safety. Marlene hesitated. This sounds pointed, Karen smiled tightly. It's about stability. People miss that. 2 days later, the article appeared. Karen didn't sign it, but everyone knew it was hers. The response? Swift and furious. Someone uploaded a picture of the article to Facebook with the caption, "Translation. Karen still doesn't get it." A comment underneath read, "Peace for who? Stability for who? You called the cops on a black hero, and now you want sympathy?" Karen tried to ignore the backlash, but the messages kept coming. Text messages from former allies, cold stares at the grocery store. Even Trish stopped responding to her emails. But Karen wasn't done. Step 2. Weaponize procedure. She knew George's term as HOA president was nearing its end. Elections were 6 weeks away. And Karen? She decided it was time to run. She created a new campaign slogan, "Bringing order back to East Briar Hills." She filed her paperwork, dusted off her old yard sign templates, and began quietly assembling her base. Retirees with outdated views, the handful of residents who resented recent changes, and a couple of ambitious board members who saw opportunity in her boldness. She knocked on doors. She printed flyers. She spoke in careful phrases like returning to values, preserving the vision, and keeping our streets safe. What she didn't say, but everyone understood, was that Karen wanted things to go back to how they were before Darius. George found out about her campaign at the same time as everyone else. When the first sign appeared in front of her home, Karen Mallory for HOA President Restore. Rebuild, respect. Darius saw it during his morning jog. He didn't say anything, just paused for a second, shook his head and kept running. Karen held a Meet the Candidate gathering at her house the following Saturday. Only 10 people came. She had snacks, iced tea, and a PowerPoint slideshow. It included charts about property values, photos of slightly overgrown lawns, and an alarming statistic about declining standards. One older couple clapped politely. Another woman asked, "What are you going to do about all this activism?" Karen paused. "I think we've let emotions run the board too long. I'll bring it back to basics. Maintenance, order, structure." No one cheered, but a few nodded. It was enough to make Karen think she had a shot. Meanwhile, George didn't campaign at all. He didn't put out signs, he didn't knock on doors. He didn't even mention the election at the next HOA meeting. But his neighbors did. One by one, residents began quietly endorsing him. Mrs. Abernathy hosted a community brunch in honor of real leadership. The Patel family organized a block cleanup and said it was inspired by George's calm integrity. Even Lily, Karen's own niece, drew a poster for school that read, "Real leaders don't call cops, they call for change." Karen saw it taped to the community bulletin board and nearly tore it down. But the most devastating blow came from someone Karen hadn't expected. Raymond, her husband. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He simply started spending more time outside, watering plants, chatting with neighbors, waving to Darius when he passed by. And then, quietly, he put a George Wilson for HOA sign on their lawn. Karen saw it when she came back from the store and dropped the grocery bag on the porch in shock. She stormed inside. "What is that?" Raymond didn't look up from his book. "It's a sign. You put it on our lawn?" "I did." She was breathless. "You know I'm running." "I know," he said quietly. "I also know you're wrong." The room went silent. Karen's throat tightened. "So you're against me?" Raymond looked at her for the first time in days. "No, Karen. I'm disappointed in you." He went back to reading. Karen stood there, unsure whether to scream, cry, or run. She did none of the above. By election week, the air in East Briar Hills was electric. Every porch had a sign. Every mailbox had a flyer. The debate forum was scheduled for Thursday night in the clubhouse. Karen rehearsed every line of her speech, over and over. She wore her best blazer, had her nails freshly done, and even color-coordinated her earrings to match her campaign's blue and gold palette. When she arrived, the room was packed, standing room only. She stepped onto the stage and looked at the sea of faces. None of them smiled, not at her. Then George stood. He didn't have a prepared speech. He didn't need one. He simply stepped to the mic and said, "Leadership isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about listening, especially when it's uncomfortable." The applause was deafening. Karen clenched her fist beneath the podium. The vote was held 3 days later. Results were posted online and at the community center. Karen got 28 votes. George got 247. She didn't leave her house for 4 days. Karen wasn't done. Not even after losing the election in a landslide. Not even after her husband quietly removed the campaign sign from the lawn and replaced it with a simple metal flower pot. Not even after she heard her own name muttered like a warning by children on bikes. Don't be a Karen. The word had taken on a life of its own. A symbol. A meme. A slur of her own making. She could have walked away. Instead, she doubled down. Karen began filing formal complaints, one after another, through the HOA portal. If she couldn't lead the board, she'd bury it in red tape. Mailbox paint chipping at 4:14. Unauthorized yard lighting at 2:19. Trash bins left visible at 5:10 p.m. on Tuesday. Petty, picky, vindictive, and relentless. George, now re-elected and well-supported, tried to handle it diplomatically. He wrote back with kind but firm notes. Thank you for your submission, Karen. This item is under review. Shimar, we've spoken with the residents and no further action is necessary. Per HOA guidelines, there is no violation. But she didn't stop. She sent 37 separate complaints in 2 weeks. Finally, George called a special board meeting with one item on the agenda: review of complaint abuse and harassment patterns. Karen showed up, of course. I have every right to file complaints, she snapped, flipping through a binder. This community has standards. And if no one else is going to enforce them, George cut her off. Calm, precise. Karen, this board has reviewed your filings. 94% were unfounded. Several targeted people of color or lower-income families. This is not enforcement, it's harassment. Gasps murmured around the room. Karen flushed. That's absurd. We have patterns, dates, names, video evidence, even your own emails. Karen's voice rose. So now I'm being punished for caring about the neighborhood? No, George said. You're being held accountable for using the rules as weapons. The board voted. Karen's access to the complaint system was officially revoked for 6 months. She sat frozen as the motion passed 6-0. The silence afterward was louder than any shouting match. But Karen still had one card to play, an anonymous tip. She contacted a local news blog and submitted an insider report accusing the HOA board, specifically George, of favoritism, bias, and racially motivated overcorrection. She even claimed Darius was covertly influencing policy despite not being a resident. The blog published it under the headline, Has East Briar Hills Gone Woke or Just Gone Wild? It didn't take long for the truth to surface. An investigative reporter traced the email tip back to Karen's IP address. Then came the second article. Karen Mallory behind false allegations. Disgraced ex-HOA member attempts retaliation. The fallout was instant. Karen's inbox filled with angry messages. Parents pulled their kids from her piano class. A local podcast invited George and Darius for a community-building segment, but when they declined, the host read aloud Karen's article and debunked it line by line. Karen was cornered. Still, she refused to apologize. Not publicly, not privately. Even when her job at the small business office was restructured. Even when the HOA quietly removed her from all event planning roles. Even when she found herself standing alone at the community picnic, holding a bowl of potato salad no one touched. She refused to back down. Because backing down to Karen was defeat. And if there was one thing Karen couldn't handle, it was losing in public. Then one night, something happened she didn't expect. Someone egged her house, not much damage. Just 3 eggs, splattered on the porch and siding. No note, no graffiti. But it rattled her. She called the police, filed a report. The officer who came was polite but disinterested. You think it was someone from the HOA? He asked flatly. Karen nodded. It's all retaliation. I've been targeted. The officer scribbled something in his notebook, glanced once around the lawn, then sighed. We'll file the report, ma'am. But off the record, maybe it's time to de-escalate. Karen stared at him. You think I brought this on myself? The officer shrugged. I think people don't throw eggs at homes without a reason. That night, Karen sat on the porch with a rag and a bucket of soapy water. As she scrubbed the dried yolk from her siding, she realized no one had come to check on her. Not a single neighbor. For the first time in years, the street felt silent. Not peaceful, just empty. She looked across the street at George's house. The porch light was on, a soft glow. Inside, she could see silhouettes. Him and Darius, seated at the kitchen table, talking, laughing. And that laughter burned more than the egg. But she still wasn't done. Because Karen had one last idea. It wasn't until the following Saturday that she saw Darius again. Karen was walking to her mailbox, slowly, almost cautiously, as if she expected the air to turn against her. Her steps were unsure, the weight of months of tension pulling on her shoulders. The front yards were blooming with spring color, but none of it felt warm. And there he was. Darius was standing beside George on the Wilsons' front lawn, holding a clipboard and chatting with a few young volunteers in matching shirts. They were organizing something. A local safety event, maybe. Karen didn't know. She wasn't invited. Still, she lingered. From across the street, Darius caught her eye. She froze. Then, he nodded. Not warmly, not forgivingly, just acknowledgement. Karen stood there longer than she should have, blinking at the smallest gesture of grace she'd received in months. And then she turned and walked back inside, letterless, mail forgotten. That night, the HOA newsletter went out by email and post. Karen received both, of course, though she hadn't read one in full since the election. But this one had a headline she couldn't ignore. Willow Circle honors Darius Wilson with Citywide Medal of Civic Service. The article was short but powerful. It detailed Darius's off-duty rescue of a child from a burning vehicle 2 weeks prior, an act that had made headlines briefly. The family lived 3 blocks outside of East Briar Hills. Darius had just finished shopping at a hardware store when the minivan caught fire. No hesitation, no uniform, just instinct and courage. He'd pulled the child out with seconds to spare. The mayor was quoted, the fire chief, even a local pastor. And then came this. While some in our neighborhood once misjudged him, Darius never judged us back. He continued to serve, to show up, to protect, even when it would have been easier to walk away. Karen reread the sentence 3 times. It hit harder than any letter, any audit, any vote she'd ever lost. Because it wasn't just about Darius anymore. It was about her. The following weekend, the community hosted a small recognition ceremony at the local park. Karen didn't attend, but she heard it. From her window, she could hear the clapping, the laughter, the gentle hum of unity that she used to control, but now came from a place she could no longer reach. She closed the blinds and sat down. For the first time in a long time, she felt empty, not angry, not self-righteous, just tired. Monday morning, Karen did something she hadn't done in years. She baked, but not to win anyone over, just to do something kind. A tray of simple oatmeal cookies. Nothing fancy. No lavender frosting or theme decorations. She wrapped them in foil and stood on her porch, staring across the street. Then with a deep breath, she crossed it. Darius answered the door. He didn't smile, but he didn't close it either. Karen held up the tray. I heard about the medal, she said softly. I wasn't invited and I get that. I just wanted to say, I see you now. I didn't before. He studied her. I'm not asking for forgiveness, she added, but I am asking for a restart. Darius looked down at the cookies, then stepped back and opened the door just a little wider. Leave them on the bench. Karen placed the tray down gently. Thank you, she whispered. Darius nodded once, then closed the door, and that was enough. Weeks passed. Karen kept her head down. She stopped filing complaints, stopped muttering under her breath at every wind chime or garden statue, stopped trying to win the invisible war she'd waged for years. She even started attending HOA meetings again, quietly in the back row, taking notes instead of speaking. And slowly, very slowly, the neighborhood softened toward her. Mrs. Abernathy waved again. Trish said hello in the produce aisle. A few kids even stopped whispering Karen when she passed by. One day she received a handwritten card in her mailbox. It had no name, no return address. Inside it said, "It's not too late to become someone worth respecting." Karen folded the card, smiled sadly, and tucked it into her recipe book. At the next annual HOA picnic, George stood up to announce a new initiative, the Willow Circle Welcome Program, pairing longtime residents with newcomers to help them adjust, connect, and feel at home. He called for volunteers. Karen raised her hand. The room turned, and after a long pause, George nodded. Thank you, Karen. That spring, a new family moved into the house 2 doors down from Karen. A young black couple with twin girls and a German Shepherd puppy. Karen showed up at their door with lemonade and a hand-drawn map of her favorite flower shops. They smiled, a little surprised, and they invited her in, just for a few minutes. Epilogue: 6 months later, Darius was promoted to battalion chief. The same week, George announced he'd be stepping down as HOA president at the end of the year. When asked if he'd recommend a successor, he said only this: I'd rather the community decide, but I will say this: leadership doesn't always look like power. Sometimes it looks like growth. Karen heard about the quote secondhand. She didn't comment, but at the next meeting, she brought extra chairs for overflow guests and sat quietly in the corner, pen in hand, listening. Really listening. The end.